Good evening, dear friends. Welcome to all of our friends gathered here in person and to those gathered on Zoom. Dear friends, it's my great privilege and honor to welcome you all to our fourth and final installment on an important discussion, an important course, Outsmarting Anti-Semitism. We've talked a lot about anti-Semitism so far. We've discussed the psychology of those oppressed. We've talked about the Jewish experience of how we feel when we experience anti-Semitism and how we might want to moderate and work through our own inner process. We've talked about how we're not allowed to be apologetic. We're not allowed, and we talked about the psychology of the haters. A hater might feel something. Again, this is not to excuse them. That's going to trigger their hatred. And we talked about all the different possible theories behind anti-Semitism. And last week, we spoke of a very important topic, which is anti-Semitism that's connected to the land of Israel. We might call it what they call it as not anti-Semitism, but anti-Zionism. And of course, we all know, as Rabbi Jonathan Sachs brilliantly put it, this is just the, how do we call it? This is just the way a virus continues to evolve and so anti-Semitism might take on some new packaging, some new branding, but it's all the same. It's an attempt to call to the highest authority and use that to besmirch the Jewish people. But long last today, we want to talk about the most important question. The question that Dr. Moskowitz has been rightfully so on my case, which is, what are we actually gonna do about it? So let's take a look. And the reality is like this. In the public arena, we frequently encounter folks with influence. Politicians, celebrities, business people, maybe a neighbor, a friend, or a person on your condo association board.
Oh, but I can't. Je n'arrive pas à l'entendre.
And sometimes those people take a position in speech or in action which seems to be anti-Semitic. They seem to be trying to do us harm. Now, we're not talking about a person who explicitly espouses anti-Semitic tropes. We're talking about people who will tell you, oh, I'm anti-Semitic. Maybe they even have a good friend that's Jewish. But the things they do or they say undermine Jewish interests, Israel interests. And so, for example, and all of us in our collective experience can think back to times where maybe there was an anti-Semitic incident, and someone was just sharing here in the class, in studio attendees, how they received a very snide and disrespectful comment about their Jewish practice. And shout out to the Cohens, good to see you guys. And it's very disappointing. Or sometimes you'll have a politician that will subtly demonize Israel, or a politician or a talking head on the television who might give a nod to boycotting Israel, or other kinds of subtle or not so subtle acts of anti-Semitism. And so the question is, what do we do? And I should really, sorry about this, we should really change this slide. But before we start, so this is all the intro to what we're going to talk about. How do you deal with a person that's a hater, or that gives us clues that they're full of hate? And I think you might find some of the ideas we discussed tonight a bit surprising. But first, I should point out, we've got an awesome new course coming in January. It's going to be about meditation, but not meditation as you might think of it, but where the place that meditation has in Judaism from Sinai in the Torah. And you might find that an eye-opening experience, but that's next course. So let's get back to our slides. Here we're talking about change of heart, how to try to change and affect change in those that are haters. And so among anti-Semitism, our question is, you meet an anti-Semite, you hear an act of anti-Semitism, you're discriminated against at work. What do you do? What do we do about it? So to start, if you could be so kind as to turn to page 114 in your student book, if you have it. And this is an exercise that will ask you to go through really fast. We're not going to hear samples, but list famous living individuals who embrace opinions or have acted in ways that are harmful to Jews. So again, we're not going to read these ones out loud, but let's give ourselves a brief mental exercise reviewing. Have you ever encountered a journalist or a person in journalism who espoused anti-Semitism? I know you're thinking, have you ever met a person in journalism that has not? Yeah, that's fair. What about entertainment? Disappointingly so, there's many people in the entertainment industry that are quite nasty and offensive to Jewish people. What about a politician? I could say personally, in our local politics, we have a story that maybe you heard about, a story with an Eruv, which was an accommodation that's needed for Shabbos observant folks. And there were some very nasty, snide comments in the local government about, oh, Jews, they need this or that. And then in academia, and again, we're not going through specific examples, but we all know what a terrible experience it could be for a proud pro-Jew, pro-Israel, or a proud Jew in academia, and how much of the sentiment runs entirely counter to anything sympathetic or appreciative of the Jewish people. So many times, the folks who we're thinking about in our minds, and we're not saying out loud necessarily, maybe we are, they have a strong influence and an impact on the Jewish person or the Jewish people's well-being. And if that's the case, that they could actually be influential, we need to figure out what to do about these people. And if we decide that one of them, a media personality or a politician, is against us, what do you do about it? So I want to go to a very specific case. And it's an interesting story where, as we know, Israel had an evolving relationship with different countries. And so there were certain nations that were very essential to the founding of the state of Israel, or in the early years that followed, but eventually took a disappointing turn. And I'm not talking about the Soviets, although that too was a big problem. I'm talking about the French. In the 50s and 60s, France was actually the primary supplier of much of Israel's hardware and weaponry. Before the Six-Day War in 67, Israel actually ordered and paid for 50 Mirage fighter jets from France. Did you know that?
Yeah.
And just before the outbreak of hostility, as we know, there was a little bit of a buildup. President de Gaulle, Charles de Gaulle? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Placed an embargo on selling military equipment to either side of the conflict, right? Sounding very neutral. The problem is, it only hurt Israel because the Egyptians and the Syrians were getting their weapons from the Russians. And so what this did is it put the Israelis at a terrible disadvantage. And in truth, people at the time observed and supposed that France was curtailing its sale to Israel because they realized it was more lucrative to have a good relationship with the Arabs than to be fair to the Israelis. And therefore, although the Israelis paid for these 50 Mirage fighter jets, they did not receive them. They were not delivered. This was galling. Get that? The gall? Okay. And it got even worse because as time passed, 67, we get to 1970, and this is what we call the war of attrition. And so there's ongoing hostilities between Israel and Egypt, especially around the Suez Canal. And at that time, President George Pompidou, is that how I pronounce it? Who was then the president of France, announced that they were going to sell Mirage jets, the same jets they refused to Israel, to Libya. Libya, of course, a sworn enemy to Israel. And they wouldn't sell to Israel, but they would sell to Libya. So we want to take a look at text 1, page 116. And this is from the New York Times, January 10th, 1970. It was reporting at the time, which reports as follows. After much hesitation, French officials acknowledged tonight, they didn't want to acknowledge it, that about 50 Mirage fighter jets would be sold to Libya. The confirmation of the sale was expected to provoke sharp protests from Israel. The Israelis suspect that those planes will eventually find themselves to the fighting fronts against Israel. The French Defense Ministry reaffirmed the French embargo policy of selling no arms to countries directly involved in the conflict, namely Israel, the United Arab Republic, Jordan, and Syria, and said they were convinced Libya was sought the supply for their own forces. Israel, of course, fears that the Libyan Mirage was based on a conviction shared by some French experts that the Libyan Air Force in its present state could not absorb such a high number of highly advanced planes. They didn't know what to do with them. And so the assumption is that Libya is a straw buyer for Israel's enemies. The fear is compounded by the aggressive stance taken towards Israel by the new revolutionary military regime of Libya, which was in power since early September. This is, again, reporting in 1970. The plane sold to Libya is believed to be the Mirage 3, the same type as the 50 built for Israel, but never delivered. The Israelis are expected to find particularly galling the fact that they have been denied the same number of planes now made available to a hostile Arab country. What a chutzpah. Could you imagine? Or, again, I wasn't around back then, but maybe some of you folks recall that time, and maybe your blood boiled when you heard about these events and you read these reports in the New York Times. Imagine if we were in 1970 right now. How would we react? And more importantly, imagine if the president of France were to come visit the States. What would be the responsibility of the Jewish people to let our opposition known, to try to change France's opinion? What should American Jews do about the situation? Or if we had to tweak it a bit, imagine if the president of France was going to come stay at the Diplomat, and we would have an opportunity, all of us here, to do something about it. What would we do? So if you'll turn to page 117, exercise 4.2, what would be the best strategy for dealing with a public figure who takes an unfavorable position towards us? And particularly, let's think of our case of the president of France refusing to sell planes to Israel, but he's willing to sell it to our enemies. How would you respond? So what would be 3 important do's and don'ts to deal with this kind of hatred, this kind of unfair treatment towards Israel or the Jewish people? 3 do's and 3 don'ts. If anyone wants to share a thought, we're Hamish. Again, we're getting ready for Thanksgiving. Some folks will be seeing recordings. I want to welcome everybody that's here, both on the screen and all those that are here in person. Anyone want to shout out? You could just share with us what would be an idea, something you should avoid when dealing with Israel's enemies or someone that's treating the Jewish people in a discriminatory manner. Reb Noyach, any thoughts?
Not that I can really vocalize.
Okay, no worries. Anyone else want to share something? Dr. Shlomo.
Don't engage in arguments.
So Dr. Shlomo says don't engage in arguments. You think it's not going to be productive? Very fair, very good. Nisim, you have any thoughts? Okay. So we're going to put this in the back burner for a moment. I'm going to get back to it. And I'm fairly certain you'll be surprised with what we share, but let's take a look. If we want to get a Torah perspective, we all have opinions. But if we want to know what the Torah has to say about how a Jew should respond to such hate and discrimination, so let's take a look at one of the earliest episodes in the Jewish story of a similar type of anti-Semitism and hatred. We're going to go to the story that we read about in a parsha or 2 ago, the story of Yaakov and Esau, Jacob and Esau. As we know, Jacob and Esau are twin brothers, but there was no love lost between them. They were as opposite as night and day. Yaakov was a man who was a bookworm. He would sit in the tent and study Torah. He was dedicated to Torah study, moral living, whereas Esau was a hunter, a murderer, and pleasure was the most important value for him. Well, as you might know, Yaakov did something to disappoint Esau a good bit. He had to run away for his life, and he eventually returns. When Yaakov returns, he finds out that Esau plans to kill him and actually greet him and his family with 400 armed assassins. So now, if you're Jacob, you just want to mind your own business and bring your family to go visit Grandpa Isaac, and all of a sudden 400 men are coming to ambush you. So what would you do? So Jacob, as we'll read, does a few different actions. So let's take a look. Text 2, page 119. Jacob did 3 things to prepare for this impending disaster, his impending encounter with the greatest hater that existed in his lifetime. So Jacob, text 2, prepared himself in 3-pronged response: a prayer, a gift, and he prepared for armed struggle. Just take a look at the screen. Not that you need a picture of prayer. Jacob prays to God to save him. Jacob sends an elaborate series of gifts to Esau, his brother, to soften him up. He sends what was most likely the most valuable currency of the day for nomadic folks: goats, sheep, ram, camel, oxen, donkeys, and he divides it so that it would be in several different deposits, looking very generous. And each delegation would say, hey, Esau, we've got a present for you from Jacob, your servant. He would really like to work things out. He would love you to receive him graciously. He would love to reunite. When Esau is about to arrive to Jacob, they stand, Jacob and his family, in formation, and there's a really touching scene. Jacob, we could imagine, probably was not interested in treating very differentially and respectfully a guy who tried to kill him and a guy who's trying to kill him again. We could imagine he would have been pretty upset and frustrated at having to act in this way, groveling, if you will. And maybe it's a sign of weakness. Yet ultimately, he does all three. He turns to God, he tries to make nice, and he prepares for war. But the part about making nice, about acting in a very diplomatic and gracious way, why did Jacob do it? And so, as a rabbi, I might say that Jacob understands that his true protection comes from God. But he wants to create space within nature for things to work out. But what's going on, and why does Yaakov do it? And is it successful? Does it work out? And so, let's take a look over here. The gift, we'll say, was about creating space for God to create a protective environment. But did it work out? Did Yaakov escape harm? Did it pay off? The three-pronged approach, was it successful? And of course, as you know, we all trace ourselves back either biologically or spiritually to Jacob. So we know that they lived happily ever after, at least for the moment. Well, let's take a look. Text 3, what happens? Esau, after getting all the gifts and seeing all the presentation, he runs towards Jacob, embraces him. He falls on Jacob's neck and kisses him. And they wept. Sounds like an emotional reunion, not the reunion of a genocidal brother coming to murder his younger brother. Apparently, this whole process must have worked. Now, here's the question. Dr. Moskowitz.
Yes.
Did Esau become a changed man who, instead of hatred for Yaakov, there was love for Jacob? Did he become an eternal ally, a perpetual ally to his brother Yaakov? Would you say so?
Hard to believe, but he kissed him and they wept together.
So it seems like there may have not been a permanent change, but there was certainly a temporary, thawing of the ice, a thawing of the hatred that existed between them. As a matter of fact, if you look on the screen or at the slide here, you'll see this is an old text of the Bible, a codex. And here we have the verse. I know it's only in Hebrew, but I just want to show you one thing. It reads as follows. Those that know Hebrew, you can see. I have my cursor here. Vayaretz Esav likrato. Esav ran towards him. We just read this verse in the circle. Vayipol al savaro, and he fell on his brother's neck. Va yishakehu, and they kissed one another. Now, actually, vayishakehu. You notice, or I want to bring your attention to something very interesting. On top of the word that's circled, you might notice what looks like a series of dots.
But we don't see that.
Do you see on the screen a word that's circled?
No, we don't see it here. How do we
You
get
don't
it?
Yeah, how do we get what?
The screen that he's.
Do you see the slides? Do you see where it says deciphering the heart?
Oh,
Does anyone see it?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
see it.
yeah, it's there.
So, Nisim, you have to move probably the pictures of all the folks that are here. You probably have to minimize that so you can see the
Okay.
slide.
it's okay.
Wait,
There
so
with symbols above the Hebrew word.
Yes, so you see there's a word circled in red and there's a bunch of little dots.
Yeah.
Those dots don't appear on every word in the Bible. As a matter of fact, they rarely, if ever, appear on the word. And it's actually a code. It's a code to tell you that you got to read a little deeper. You got to read between the lines because it's not what it seems like. And so, what do those dots mean? So if you take a look at text 120, we have an early rabbinic midrash that discusses the verse. Again, we are on page 120. It says like this: the Torah features dots over the words. Again, if you want to see what it looks like, you can look on the screen and you can see the word circled in red and you see these little dots.
I don't know.
Text 4.
No,
The dots over the word he kissed them is because Esau did not kiss Jacob wholeheartedly. They kissed each other, but it wasn't with all his heart. It wasn't with full sincerity. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says, it's an established fact that Esau hates Jacob. But in that very moment,
His
he
compassion.
was
When he went to that
moved
class that he told me tomorrow.
and he kissed him wholeheartedly. So Esau doesn't become, according to Rabbi Shimon, a changed person, but temporarily his emotions, he became in touch with his emotions. It was a good therapy session, apparently. He was able to.
Good.
I'm sorry?
No,
No, she was
no,
talking
I
to
was
my
asking
dad.
my
Okay, no
husband
problem.
who was listening in.
Okay, fantastic. So here we have two opinions. Vayishakeu. Either it was temporary,
Call me
it was
tomorrow.
temporarily genuine, or it was fake. Okay, so what do we do about that? If the fact that Esau's kissing was not permanent, their brotherhood was not forever, does that mean that Jacob failed in his mission? Does that mean that what Jacob did was a waste of time?
No,
One might make the argument that it was not a waste of time. Why? Because Jacob at that time had an objective. You know what his objective was? He wanted to get past Esau and go to Hebron to visit his dad. That was a successful venture. He got there. And so, although maybe Jacob didn't have an eternally changed relationship with his estranged brother, temporarily he navigated past a tough cookie. He navigated past someone who really hated him. And so therefore, the story can be perceived as a success. Okay, what does this verse have to do with our discussion about anti-Semites? So I'll tell you what, and Dr. Moskowitz, I understand you might get a little frustrated. I want to tell you something. I didn't make up the correlation. I didn't make it up. You know where I got it?
No,
I got it from the Talmud. And in a few minutes, we're going to see the Talmud makes the connection. And so as we talk about anti-Semitism, we need to have practical suggestions. We also want to see it from its evolution and its development throughout Jewish tradition. So again, throughout Jewish tradition, Jews have looked towards the story of Jacob and Esau as a code, as a clue to how to navigate haters and hatred. So here, let's go to text 121. Nachmanides, you know what Nachmanides was? Moshe, son of Nachman. He tells us the Medrash relates when Rabbi Yanai would set out for a meeting with the Roman government officials. So Rabbi Yanai was a great sage of the Talmud. He was a student of Rabbi Yehuda, the prince, and he lived in the late 200s. And they were still dealing with the Romans. He lived in Israel. And before he would leave Israel to go visit the Romans, to appeal to them, to treat the Jewish people favorably, that's my commentary I snuck in over here, he would always first read this passage in the Torah about Jacob and Esau. So I'm just going to go back for a moment. This part of the Torah that we're looking at over here with the circle of Vayishakeu, he kissed him and he embraced him and he sent gifts and he prepared for battle. That very narrative he would read every time he would go to Rome. The sages had a tradition that this passage was a guide for our exile. Therefore, when Rabbi Yanai would visit the rulers of Rome for communal issues, he would consult this passage and follow the advice of Jacob, and indeed appropriate for all generations to study his approach and to adopt it in actual practice. So the sages of the Talmud, the sages of the Midrash create an association between this story and dealing with influences and forces who have the ability to affect the Jewish well-being, and many of them steeped with hatred. What might the lesson be? So I'll tell you what lesson Rabbi Yanai took. And again, we might not like this, but it's good to know before we get into our practical discussion. One of the lessons Rabbi Yanai must have taken is that when possible, and actually I think it's something like what Dr. Shlomo said, when possible, we try to avoid outright conflict and clash. A problematic ruler of a Gentile society really was not someone that ideally you'd want to fight with, nor do you want to burn your bridges. On the contrary, if you play your cards right, you could play them to obtain whatever was necessary and vital for Jewish survival. You have to be ready to fight, but that has to always be plan D. When all other routes fail, then you might want to consider how to have a fight. And so Jacob was sending perhaps a message to Rabbi Yanai, his great-grandson. They're going to deal with the Romans. They're haters. They're not great people, but you'll get more by being pragmatic and with diplomacy than with fights. One more example. One of the most famous rabbis of the Mishnah is called Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. He celebrated, if anyone was in Israel, his tomb is in Meron, and he celebrated on Lag BaOmer. And he taught, and we quoted him on 121, that, no, I'm sorry, we're going to quote him in a moment. He says, Esav hates Jacob. It's a fact. Esav hates Jacob. We quoted it on page 120. But even though he knew that there was a lot of hatred between Esav and Jacob, and there was a lot of hatred between the Romans and the Jews, he too, before lobbying Rome, would also try to use diplomacy. Here's a story. He would use diplomacy. Text 6 really fast. Actually, I'm just going to gloss over. But basically, the Romans once made a decree. They wanted the Jewish people to lose their identity. This is after the devastating failure of the Bar Kokhba revolt. So as we know, after the fall of the temple, there was a rebellion to attempt to restore Jewish independence. And it was the Bar Kokhba revolt led by Shimon ben Koziba. For a while, he created an autonomous zone. They minted their own coins. And as a matter of fact, Dr. Moskowitz, you saw this? The sifting project in Israel, where they sift through earth that was removed from the Temple Mount. I believe they found the coin, and now I'm actually not sure if it was from the last years of the temple or if it was from the revolt of Bar Kokhba. But either way, Rabbi Shimon lives to see the fall of Bar Kokhba. And the Romans, after that failed rebellion, were absolutely brutal to the Jewish people. They wanted the Jewish people to lose their identity. And so they decreed, how do you make a Jew lose their Jewish identity? You take away things that are central to Jewish practice. And 3 items they decided is no observing Shabbat. They wanted to ban circumcision, and they didn't want to allow for family purity. The Jews said, we need to send somebody to Rome to lobby for us. Who did they select? Rabbi Shimon. He was experienced in miracles. But hold on, isn't Rabbi Shimon the one who says the Romans are haters? Why is he going down to Rome? And we find that he actually was successful. The answer is, you could know someone's a hater, but if you're goal-oriented, what you really care about is the objective, before deciding that haters are going to hate, you could try to manipulate them, you could try to massage them, and you could try to get what you need out of them. Shockingly, Rabbi Shimon knew that it was an established fact that Rome hated Israel, but he traveled to Rome, he used diplomacy, successful. Now I want to share with you something that existed throughout history, particularly in the Ashkenazic world. Actually, I take that back. In the Ashkenazic and Sephardic world. And anyone familiar with the word shtadlan? Shtadlan. A shtadlan or a shtadlanim were lobbyists.
Wow.
They were influential Jewish merchants, rabbis who had dynamic personalities, and they were either nominated or self-appointed to try to work with the ruling officials to better the circumstances of the Jewish people. And some of the very famous Jewish leaders that we know about actually had this role. For example, have you ever heard of the Abarbanel? Sometimes referred to as the Abravnel. And actually, if you turn to figure 4.1 on page 123, you'll see here 6 names of 6 Ashkenazic Shtadlanim, Jewish advocates. We're going to talk about Joseph of Rashaim from Vienna, 1480 to 1554. But you also have Jacob Basevi, Samuel Oppenheimer, if you take a look, Lefman Behrens. Samson Wertheimer, and several others. And one of the most famous of these folks, these lobbyists, these advocates, is someone called Joseph of Russia. And he was actually tasked with lobbying the Holy Roman emperors. So we're talking about in the late 1400s, 1500s, Maximilian I and Charles V. These were two rulers of the Roman kingdom, if whatever you called it back then. They hated Jews. As a matter of fact, Charles V was the grandson of King Ferdinand and Isabella, who banished the Jews from Spain. And even though they probably hated the Jews, Joseph of Rashaim visits their courts a number of times, and he manages to lobby them favorably on behalf of the German Jewish community, which was then influenced and under the Holy Roman Emperor. So here we have an interesting text, the Memoirs of Joseph of Rashaim, 124. See the title, A Court Jew. 1531, folks, announcers once again hounded the emperor in Belgium and Holland, and they requested that I travel to those lands to oppose the accusers against Jews. I was at the court of the exalted emperor for 4 months, from Adar 1 till Sivan, pursuing the interests of the Jewish people. And although he seems to have had a nemesis called the Rotherite, who tried to swallow me alive, bring me to my demise, God in his mercy sent his messenger, saved me from his hands and all those who sought to harm me. The time he writes, I had an audience with the emperor in his private chamber. I spoke to him for as long as I needed. He responded sympathetically. During this period, he lived by himself. You have to understand, Jews weren't allowed in this region, Belgium or Holland. And so he was all alone, the only Jew. And he writes that during that period, I had free time. He was secluded in his room, and he wrote a book called The Sanctified Paths. Tragically, the book is lost, but it wasn't lost in his day. And there are a number of citations of that book. And so we see here is we have a Jew, Joseph of Rashaim, who knew that he was dealing with haters, but he wasn't afraid to lobby them gently and cleverly. And ultimately, he secures favor from those people. Now, this model didn't always work. There are countless episodes of Jews trying to be a lobbyists or advocates, and they were killed in the process. Or other failures. For example, the Abarbanel. Anyone know the story of the Abarbanel or the legend of the Abarbanel? They say that the Abarbanel almost manages to convince King Ferdinand and Isabella to cancel the expulsion. You know what happened next? Anybody know the story? So the head of the Inquisition, the chief inquisitor, they say runs into the room as Abarbanel is offering a large sum of money to the king to cancel the decree. And he says, Judas sold you-know-who for 30 coins. You want to sell him a second time? And actually, if you take a look here, we have a painting or a picture of a painting, 126. And that's what this picture purports to portray, the Abarbanel's attempt to bribe the king and the chief inquisitor thwarting those plans. And ultimately and tragically, the Jews of Spain either converted out of Judaism or were banished from Spain, along with Abarbanel and many others. Sometimes these shtadlans, sometimes these advocates worked. Sometimes they failed miserably, but it seems like this was the common practice. Were they begging? Were they belittling themselves? You might think so, but I would disagree. They were using nature. They were following the common practice to use the capacity to lobby and to use their wisdom and personality to secure blessings on behalf and for the Jewish people. And so it seems like what we're saying is that Jews figure they could even gain from people that we know who hate us. And we're claiming that to do so is not making you inferior. It's recognizing that Hashem is ultimately in charge and to not feel inferior. But the question is like this. If a person is a hater, how can you change their mind? Or if they do change their mind, then what does it mean? Where did the hate go? So modern neuroscience has an interesting perspective that I would claim Hasidic thought has long made this very same case. You know what I'm going to say? Human beings are complicated creatures. And so, would you agree with that?
Yeah.
So you have, let's say, Mel Gibson, who was pulled over in 2006 in Malibu, California. He fails a breathalyzer test. And as he's being arrested, he asks the officer if he's Jewish. The officer confirms that he was Jewish. And he screams at him, Jews are responsible for all the wars in the world. The media hears about this. They ask Gibson, and he apologizes. And he asks people to realize that he's not an anti-Semite. Do you remember this? I mean, he also made The Passion, which wasn't exactly the most philo-Semitic work in the world, but let's not go there now. So some people claimed that this episode is evidence that he was really an anti-Semite.
Oh.
Others, including had some Jewish friends, right? We said that everyone has a good Jewish friend, said no, he was under pressure or he was upset, but he didn't really mean it. It was the alcohol. And so there is a neuroscientist who wrote an article then, or a little bit later, he writes an article about the cognitive diversity of a person. What does that mean? 128, text 8a. Brains are like representative democracies. They are built in multiple overlapping experts who weigh in and compete over different choices. What he's saying in layman's terms is that we all have in our mind, in our hearts, different voices that are competing to influence our decision. And so there's all these different conversations. And, for example, I'm paraphrasing. He says, someone offers you chocolate cake. So there's one voice in your head that says, yummy, I love chocolate cake. And there's another voice that says, hey, I've been on a diet for 20 days and I'm making headway. Let's not do this. And so what do you decide? And so the answer ultimately is, as the final paragraph, as the French essay says, there is as much difference between us and ourselves as there is between us and others. Love this one. In other words, the way I understand it, we are complicated beings. And so you could have a person who has a voice in their head that's full of hate, and sometimes that breaks free. And we're not here, this is not about apologizing for people's hatefulness, not at all. It's just to understand why we might plausibly be able to work and affect change, even with a person who's already had a strike or two. And so he writes in this essay, 129 and 8b, back to Mel Gibson and his drunken tirade. Are those his true colors? So he says, I'm not defending his behavior, but he's saying that there's a team of rivals in his brain. And alcohol is not a truth serum. It simply pushed one side into the fore. But this was just but one of many different voices. And so what's the point here? Again, not about apologizing for anti-Semites. They can do all the apologizing themselves. But the question is, do we give up on a person who one time espouses an anti-Semitic sentiment? And so the case that we're making based on the Talmud, based on the Midrash, is to give people an opportunity to allow their other voices to be more dominant in the conversation. And so now we understand how Rabbi Shimon is willing, although he knows that Esau, he knows that Rome, he knows that the haters are full of hate, he's not afraid to go down and have a conversation because he knows he might be able to massage and activate the reason, the voice of reason, and the part of those people that are willing to realize that it's worthwhile to treat the Jewish people favorably. Similarly, Jacob understands that Esau is a tormented person. If he gives him enough care and a delicate soothing of his ego, Esau will be able to come in tune with the part of his heart that is full of brotherhood.
Be right back.
And similarly, not all, there are some people that are beyond hope, in my opinion, but there are some people that are just foolish or waiting to be educated, and we have the opportunity without overstepping our own bounds to help people become more aligned with true values that we think are important. So let's now go back to our original story about the French president. So today is not like Joseph of Russia. Joseph of Russia lived in the late 1400s, early 1500s. He did not have the capacity to do anything other than grovel and be very delicate and with finesse to try to make the king, the emperor like. Today's a different world. Today there's Twitter. Today we can gather a big demonstration. Today we can make a lot of noise and we have a lot of options to us. Today, Joseph of Rashan would have probably gathered or could have gathered a whole group of people to hold signs outside of the palace saying down with the emperor. He could have done that. So what do we do? Is it possible that demonstrating or loud noise is not always the answer? And so I don't know if that's true. I think every scenario is different, but I want to share with you about the story of the French and the mirages. So here we have 131. In 1970, the French president, Mr. Pompidou, came to meet the president of the United States, to meet President Nixon. So here we have, text 9, President Nixon made a trip to New York to apologize to President Pompidou. You know why? He was angered by what he termed insults to himself and his wife, because when he was in New York, there was a large pro-Israel demonstration. The French were insulted and angered by the jostling his folks received from demonstrators in Chicago. People were booing him, and he viewed it as hostile acts supported by the Chicago police. So what did the Jews do? Not only the Jews, I should say, what did pro-Israel folks do? They went to war. They let their voices be heard, and they hassled the president. They let him know about it. You know what's interesting? The Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, the Holy Lubavitcher, a lover of Israel, a lover of the people of Israel, a person who very strongly supported Jewish pride, Gaon Yaakov, had a very interesting take on this episode. You may be surprised to hear. I was. The public protest, he said, against the president of France angered French officials. And what you don't know, says the Rebbe, but he knew because he was involved in advocacy behind the scenes, is this blocked any lobbying efforts the French Jews were trying to make to prevent or reduce French assistance to the Arab countries. So what the people in America who meant very well didn't know is that there was actually discrete efforts that were achieving success. The stated reason for the protest was to demonstrate that America is a democratic country and that American Jews are not cowardly. It's a worthwhile objective. But that's only when Jewish lives are not at stake. Being that Jews are threatened with the sale of many military jets of Libya, we have two options. We can make public protests, or we can make an effort to postpone the sale, reduce the number of jets, or at least prevail upon the French to send less effective planes. Such aims can only be achieved through quiet diplomacy. The proof is that agreements of this nature have been reached in the past. The Rebbe didn't mention it here, but he ends up mentioning it in the next talk, that they actually had an agreement with the president of France to curtail certain weapons to Libya and to receive and restore certain orders to Israel. And the public protest caused those orders to be canceled. And when things quieted down, they were able to be restored again. And so here we have a shocking, again, I was shocked until I saw this episode. I was very surprised. But here we have an instance where the Jacob Esau paradigm would have worked and seems to have worked even in a more modern time, where certain government officials have a certain public persona, but if we deal with them privately, we might sometimes be more effective. And one more example we mentioned last week. Jesse Helms was a senator from North Carolina. And he was known, I mentioned this at the end of last week's class, he was known to be anti-Israel. He was known to be anti-Israel. He voted every time he voted against foreign aid to Israel. In '82, when Israel invaded Lebanon, he suggested that America cut off relations with Israel. Pro-Israel groups were very angry. In '84, Chabad had an event in Washington to celebrate or to mark what was known as Education Day. The Rebbe's 82nd birthday was honored by President Reagan and both houses of the Congress. And invited to this event, there was a reception. And one of the folks that came to the reception was this Senator Jesse Helms from North Carolina. Harvard professor Alan Dershowitz saw in the papers that Jesse Helms was invited, and he wrote a scathing letter to the Rebbe saying, how could Chabad give honor to a person who is so anti-Israel? And so the Rebbe's response was 2 points. Number one, Chabad didn't honor him. He attended a reception. But number two, and I'm not going to read it inside, page 136, but I advise you to take a look. He basically says that in experience, actually, let's take a look at the second paragraph, text 11. You'll love this. Dr. Moskowitz, check this out. My experience with such people, though I've never met this person, has convinced me that politicians are generally motivated more by expediency than by conviction. Sounds right?
100%.
So in other words, their public pronouncements on issues don't come from a categorical principle or religious imperative. Hence, most of them, if not all, are subject to change their positions depending on the time, place, and other factors. Therefore, he says, I believe the proper approach here is not to be rigid. Don't engage in a cold war, which could turn into a hot war. Even though it's tempting, it's counterproductive. On the contrary, try to find a way to persuade the person to have at least a publicly favorable response. We don't have too many friends, and it's not always good for us to label people as our enemies. And the Rebbe says there are many instances where this has been successful. Professor Dershowitz, when he recounts the story, says that indeed, not long after this event, Senator Helms was appointed to the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he became one of the very strong supporters of Israel in that said committee. And so it's clear that the Rebbe's philosophy, and the Rebbe predicted accurately that Jesse Helms is just a politician. You give him the right covet, you talk to him nicely, and you could turn him from an enemy to a hater. So I don't know exactly why he changed his position. Yeah. I'm sorry?
To a friend. You said you can turn him from an enemy to a hater?
Oh, I'm sorry. From an enemy and a hater to a friend. I don't know. I didn't see an interview with Jesse Helms. I don't know why he evolved. But at the very least, if we don't want to give Chabad credit, which is okay, at the very least, the Rebbe accurately called the fact that Jesse Helms was open to moderation. He was open to an evolution. And that's ultimately what happened. And so the lesson here is as follows. We have to try to stay optimistic. We have to try to work even with folks who don't like us. Again, I'm not talking about outright haters. Those, we should write them off. But you have these people there in middle, and they may say a thing or two that's disappointing, but we would do better to avoid labeling them and instead work to bring them over onto our side. And this is the formula by Jacob. Let me just catch up on the slides, and I want to pause because I've been doing a lot of talking and I want to hear your thoughts. So let's just do this real fast. So in the modern era, we have the option to be more abrasive and more forceful, and sometimes we should be. But in the Torah, we find that Jacob, before fighting, chooses to give gifts. And it's a reminder not to disregard the possibility of having a positive influence. So for example, Jesse Helms, here, when he passed away, he's remembered as an Israel supporter, even though initially that was certainly not the case. So what's the lesson? Practically, we could try to be slower to name and shame. We always love to say, this person's a hater. I know it, I relate to it. We've had times that, different things have happened, and my instinct is to put out a big, loud public statement. But before we do that, it would be advantageous for us to first give the person a chance to come over. And I don't want to share it now in a recording, but I do have an instance of a person that explicitly espoused a lot of hate and vitriol towards the Jewish community. And we ended up establishing a warm and working relationship. And I was criticized by some people for being too nice to that individual. But ultimately, you have to give a person a chance to evolve, and you have to help them through it. So we should never take war off the table, but it should be only a last option. First, we should try gifts, softness, intelligent and compelling dialogue. And this is in truth a message to all of us, because especially the day of Facebook and social media, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't write passionate posts on social media, that's fine. But we do need to remember that when we're dealing with real people and with influence, we should first give a chance, give a shot, and try to work with them. And you'll be surprised how little value, how fickle people's values are, to the point that you could get them to be a hater to someone that supports important Jewish causes. And I'm thinking mostly about pro-Israel. So there are a lot of people that we could work with in outreach, and before writing them off, we could try to get them on board. And it's not always going to happen, but it's something that will be much more fruitful and something that we should certainly consider. And there's another lesson, which is a little bit more disappointing, but I want to say this too, which is as follows. We should never take a person's friendship and support for granted. I mean, in Israel or in Jewish affairs, because when you take a person for granted, a person, we have to constantly cultivate that relationship, and we have to constantly cultivate and not take for granted that a person that's a politician that's favorable to Israel, favorable to the Jewish people, is not able to be lobbied. Because if you think there aren't opposing forces making their best effort, we're mistaken. And so therefore, we should cultivate relationships and try to influence haters to become lovers. And we should also not take for granted those who are putting themselves out there and supporting Israel and supporting important causes that we find to be valuable. And the point is, we need to do everything we can to draw forth people's goodness and see and help them find within themselves positive traits. This is, of course, relevant to community leaders, and it's also relevant to our friends and neighbors, because it's not just the politician or the media guy or the whatever. We all have the person in the classroom who says, oh, he's the anti-Semite. Or you have a neighbor who, whatever, or a coworker who does offensive things. And they may be terribly offensive, and maybe they're broken. Probably they're broken. But we can also apply the Jacob principle and try to have some dialogue and find out what went wrong in their childhood that causes them to be so bitter. And so, and maybe just maybe, we can help them out and bring them onto the team. And so that's an important thing to consider. So again, we don't put trust in our friends. We don't take anything for granted. We place our trust in God. We give it our best shot, and we try to be a positive influence for the folks around us. I want to show you an awesome, an important video, but I first would like to hear from our dear and esteemed members of the group, especially those that are on Zoom. I'd like to give a few minutes to hear what you think.
Well,
You're wise, Rabbi.
I'm sorry.
I said you're wise, Rabbi.
Thank you, but I don't want you to agree. That's boring.
no,
push
you
back.
want, the three-pronged approach is a prayer, which was a great story, praise the Lord and pass the ammunition.
That too.
The second is gift, which is beautiful. And the third is irrelevant if you don't have the strength to back up, and that you're not, if you're such a weak person or country. Nixon gave in because Israel threatened to use the atom bomb. It's the strength that matters. I mean,
Yes.
armed struggle is irrelevant unless you have something strong, which we never had before. We got it now. So the main thing we have to do is trust in God and support Israel as best we can.
Oh, Shkoyach, Dr. Moskowitz. I'm almost ready to hand over my rabbinic post to you, because you said it so well and so. Thank you, Doctor. Any other thoughts before we go to the film? Rabbi Renaya?
I mean, I hate to disagree with the JLI.
I'm inviting you to disagree, so please go ahead.
I mean, I do like disagreeing, so this is cool.
Good.
Going back to the whole Mel Gibson thing, where it said that alcohol is not a truth serum. I've worked in many a bar, and I've spent a good chunk of my adult life in many a bar. Alcohol is a truth serum. What Mel Gibson said was what he meant, and that's just my shekel.
It actually makes me think, what's it called? Borat, right? There's like the scene where he goes into a bar and he's talking about Jews, throwing Jews down the well.
Exactly.
And so there's certainly a case then. I guess the point of that article, this neurologist, was just that people are complicated. And so that same guy probably has a voice in his head saying, I really shouldn't hate Jews before I find out why I hate them. I should talk to one of them first, but the other side of his voice says, it's my tradition. It's how I was brought up. It's how I feel. It's my friends say. And so the point was simply that there's another side, there's another voice that can be cultivated and supported. But you are correct that tragically we should not be Pollyanna about it and just imagine that it's all imaginary. No, there's real dislike, there's real hate. And you're right, alcohol can be a wonderful truth serum. But the case that neurologist was writing is there may be something more to the story as well. So
Noah is so on target with that one. If you study cognitive behavior therapy, Noah hit this right on the point. You just spend 6 months studying cognitive behavior therapy, and you know just what Noah said is true.
Thank you.
Yep, shkoyach doctor, shkoyach noyach. All right, so let's take a look now at a cute little film that makes the same point about how we can be influential and change the conversation and pick up people instead of just fighting them. And I think you'll like this. And do me a favor, Reb Noach especially, if the sound is working and if the audio and the visual part is working, just give me a thumbs up so I know that we're on target.
All right. Okay.
Negative thoughts, actions, and speech create negative energy. Conversely, positive thoughts, actions, and speech create positive energy. And that's what led, with an idea that has its genesis in South Africa, to the idea of ARC, acts of random kindness. You see, this is kind of shaped a little bit, more or less, if you use your imagination, like Noah's Ark. And the idea is you take some change, you place it in here, and when it's filled up, we pass it along to someone who's less fortunate. It isn't just the money collected. It's the thought and the feeling that it represents.
So I went to a public school. I studied math and physics, and we studied how to solve math problems. I didn't know how to solve my own problems.
Rabbi David Aaron, a Jerusalem-based educator, reflects on his personal experience.
The real problems of life is what education should be focusing on. It's essentially about building people, and only great people will do great things.
It is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Wilson Reagan. Mr. President.
On March 30th, 1981, then President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, delivered a luncheon address at the Washington Hilton.
Thank you. You can see it.
He left the hotel at 2:27 p.m., but as he headed to his limousine, a would-be assassin opened fire. Reagan was critically wounded, and the nation collectively gasped in horror. The president survived, and at a public gathering 2 weeks later, the Lubavitcher Rebbe insisted that the instructive lesson of the assassination attempt must similarly survive. The Rebbe saw the event as a wake-up call for the nation to upgrade its approach to education.
Door der Chok HaMedina medav gehen in a Beis Sefer. In der Beis Sefer meyusod und durchgenommen. A was darf geben a Beis Sefer darf geben Yidis. Nicht darf ausformen, aufmachen. Dem Jeser Leib Hodom, als soll sein mit Midis Tevis. Und soll wissen, als stark, als geht und lernt in dem Beis Sefer. Aber der Riker lernen seiner ist, was zum Ton Teva sich. Und das der Teva Amiti für sich. Und das ist im Ganzen nicht rein in der Tochnis und in der Programm von Beis Sefer.
As much as we want to graduate mathematicians and scientists, we also want to graduate decent human beings.
Dr. Rona Novick, Dean of the Azrieli Graduate School of Jewish Education and Administration, has given ample thought to this problem.
Very few educators would invite a charismatic speaker or have a big assembly program to create readers. They would understand that the way that we build reading skills is piece by piece and building block by building block. We start in kindergarten and first grade and we keep building on it. Well, we need to look at character education and social emotional learning in exactly the same way.
Judaism teaches us that it's important to give charity every day. And the more you give charity, that muscle of kindness within you gets stronger and stronger.
Rabbi Levi Greenberg and his wife Shana are emissaries of the Lubavitcher Rebbe in El Paso, Texas.
We embarked on a campaign to bring this message of daily giving to every single child in El Paso. And so we brought to El Paso the ARC campaign.
Rabbi, are you still working on it?
All the
Because we don't
children
see
in the
anything.
school received one of these boxes, and they were told that the
Nissim, you don't see anything?
No, sorry.
Noah, do you see something?
Yeah. Okay. If you go to the top of the video.
Oh, switch to screen share, is that it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
If-
There we go, sorry.
purpose of this box is to be taken home and filled every day.
I see it now.
If they have extra coins, they should ask their parents for some money. After a month of collecting money, their class would nominate charities that should receive their combined money. And the winning charity would receive the combined monies that they had collected throughout that month. The ARC project, giving money every day, takes acts of random kindness and turns them into acts of routine kindness.
Raising a generation of individuals empowered with a sense of purpose and trained to pursue acts of kindness is an important factor in curing and preventing numerous social ills, including the reduction of hate and bigotry, along with anti-Semitism.
The more we give, the more we respect. We respect human life, we respect property, the more dignity we have for ourselves and for society. If we want to stop anti-Semitism, we have to stop hatred. And we have the opportunity to nip hatred in the bud by increasing in acts of goodness and kindness and inspiring and encouraging all of humanity to do so. Every single person should give charity every day, and hatred will be a thing of the past.
The call of the hour, more necessary than ever, is for each of us to adopt a charity box for regular, daily contributions, and to encourage all around us, family and friend, Jew and non-Jew, to act similarly. Actively demonstrate, encourage, and promote kindness, sympathy, and altruistic care. If a little illumination eliminates a lot of darkness, think of what a rapidly swelling force of systematic goodness can achieve for our communities, and ultimately for humanity. It's time to turn up the light.
That's sweet.
My dear friends, let's give a little recap. Hold on, let's get here. As we draw near to the end of our fourth and final lesson of Outsmarting Anti-Semitism, let's give a little bit of a recap of some of the things we discussed. Of course, by noting that as long as there is an Esau, as long as there's an Esav, there's always a question, there's always a struggle. It's not an easy road. Try to figure out diplomacy, when to use our force. But we pray for a time when the Mashiach will come, where there will be no more of this conflict, no more of this hatred. And it's that process, the attempt to create morality, values in the people around us that usher the world and bring the world closer to that time. But until then, until the time that the wolf lied down with the lamb, we do need to contend with anti-Semitism. And so let's take a look in your book on figure 4.3, 139. This is a very, very brief summary of some of the important points we've discussed. It's important to stay calm. We should not allow ourselves to panic and magnify the threat we perceive. We should trust in God. And part of the process of being safe is upgrading our connection to Him. We should also be sure to create natural means through which God can provide security. So again, it's not like the person whose house is flooding and he says, God will help, until he's on the roof and the helicopter flies by and he says, no, God won't. We have to rely on God. We have to also realize that God expects us to do our best and to use best technologies to keep secure and protected. We should be open about our Jewish identity, which benefits Jews and fosters diversity. We shouldn't be ashamed or feel the need to hide our identity. We will share awareness of God's mission for all of humanity. The fact that we have value, we see value in every human being. Hopefully, helping individuals avoid experiencing an inner void, which many times leads to crime. We should thank God for the divine gift of the Holy Land and seek to strengthen Israel, its security, and its prosperity. And lastly, we could try to work to avoid labels and public shaming when possible, and instead work with whomever we can to ensure beneficial results for the Jewish people. And then, of course, there is one more thing. One of the things that Haman says that leaves the Jewish people vulnerable is their lack of unity. When we don't have unity, and of course, this is one of the things that keep us up at night, and Dr. Moskowitz, you and I, we've discussed this a good bit. And but ultimately, Haman understands that when the Jewish people are fractured, and when we're fighting each other, we're stabbing each other in the back, and we're not supporting the needs of the Jewish people in Israel, we then become vulnerable. As Haman tells Achashverosh, page 140, text 12a, says there's a nation that's scattered and dispersed. He's trying to say they are vulnerable. And so, of course, the pushback, the solution, the response is to try to foster greater unity among the Jewish people so that we're supporting one another and protecting each other. And we show those who wish to start up with us that we're united. It's not worth taking us on. And then, of course, there's also a spiritual blessing that comes from unity. And so, my dear friends, the thing that we can only really control is the way we interact with our fellow man. The broader issues, we try our best, we do our best, we make best efforts, security, we pray to God. But when we reach out to one another in love, we create a stronger front to protect and defend one another. And it is this unity that is our superpower to fight against anti-Semitism on all senses, both practical and mystical. My dear friends, this is also the way you'll usher in the arrival of Mashiach Tzidkenu speedily in our days. May it be so. So just to recap, it's hard to pay heed to our leaders. It's hard to have a cohesive strategy. When we gather together, that's when it all works out. So togetherness is crucial for protection. We can collaborate together to find solutions, and we can channel God's blessings.
Lesson 4.
My dear friends, this concludes a 4-week journey through an attempt to understand anti-Semitism, starting from understanding ourselves, to try to understand the anti-Semites, to try to have a narrative and clarity about Israel, and ultimately to realize we need to push back, sometimes with force. We start with love. Well, not with love, I'm sorry. We want to start with diplomacy. We want to try to be persuasive. We want to try to unify, because our unity too scares away those who hate us. My dear friends, hopefully the story of anti-Semitism will remain an abstract academic conversation. We pray for the protection of the Holy Land of Israel and our people, di b'chol asar v'asar, wherever they may be. Thank you for joining us, either in person or virtually or in the future. Your attendance means a lot. Please stay tuned for our next lesson, all about meditation in the Bible. You're going to find it fascinating. You don't need to be fascinating. You don't need to be into meditation to find it interesting. You'll love it. Stay tuned. Hopefully coming to you, theaters near you around January time. So look forward to seeing you all there. Until then, important PSA, and then we'll call it a day. Hanukkah starts this Sunday night. Lots of cool stuff happening throughout Hanukkah. Most importantly, the first night of Hanukkah, we'll have our grand beachside celebration. Fireworks, sand-sculpted menorah. It's been called the most Florida way to celebrate Hanukkah. You don't want to miss it. Hold on, I'm still tinkering with you folks. You don't want to miss the celebration. Everyone's invited. It's Sunday, just a little bit north of Johnson Street, Charno Park, from 4 o'clock and on. And what else?